I was standing in my kitchen, pouring my first cup of coffee when I heard the sound of a chainsaw tearing through wood in my backyard, and my heart dropped straight into my stomach because I knew exactly what that sound meant. I rushed to the window, and sure enough, 3 people in bright orange vests were actively dismantling sections of my custom cedar fence that I had just paid $8,000 to install 2 months ago. My name is Xavier Fullerton, and I had lived in the Meadowbrook Springs subdivision in Scottsdale, Arizona for exactly 4 years. The neighborhood was one of those planned communities where every house looked slightly different but somehow exactly the same, with manicured lawns and strict rules about everything from mailbox colors to the acceptable height of garden gnomes. I had never had any major issues with the homeowners association until I put up that fence, and even then, I thought we had resolved everything weeks ago. I sprinted out my back door, still in my pajama pants and bare feet, my coffee mug somehow still clutched in my hand. The Arizona morning sun was already heating up the concrete patio as I ran across it. "Hey, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted over the roar of the chainsaw. The man operating it finally noticed me and shut it off. The sudden silence was almost as jarring as the noise had been. All 3 of them turned to look at me with expressions that ranged from uncomfortable to defiant. 2 men and 1 woman, all wearing those orange safety vests over regular clothes. "HOA ordered removal," the chainsaw operator said, pulling out a work order from his back pocket. He was probably in his 50s, with a weathered face and graying hair under a baseball cap. "We're just doing our job, buddy." "My fence was approved," I said, trying to keep my voice level even though my hands were shaking with adrenaline. "I have the paperwork inside. This is my property." The woman, who looked to be in her 30s with a tight ponytail and a clipboard, stepped forward. "We have authorization from the HOA board. Take it up with them. We were hired to do this work." I looked at the damage they had already done. 3 sections of my beautiful cedar fence were completely demolished, the wood lying in splintered pieces across my lawn. The posts had been cut down to ground level, and they were clearly working their way around the entire perimeter. "Stop right now," I said firmly. "Do not touch another inch of my fence until I sort this out. If you continue, you're destroying my personal property and I will call the police." The 3 contractors exchanged glances. The chainsaw guy shrugged. "Look, man, we get paid either way. But you need to take this up with whoever hired us." Lady named Patricia Hendricks. She's the HOA president. Of course it was Patricia. I should have known the moment I heard that chainsaw. Patricia Hendricks was the stereotypical HOA president. The kind of person who seemed to have no other purpose in life than making everyone else miserable. She was probably 55, always wore tennis outfits even though I had never seen her near a tennis court, and had that particular haircut that somehow screamed, "I want to speak to the manager," from 100 yards away. Since moving into Meadowbrook Springs, I had witnessed her measure people's grass with a ruler, complain about Christmas decorations in January, and fine someone for having their garage door open for more than 30 minutes. "I'm calling her right now," I said. "Do not do anything else until I talk to her." I pulled out my phone and dialed Patricia's number, which unfortunately I had saved after our previous fence discussions. She answered on the 3rd ring, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Xavier, good morning. I assume you are calling about the fence removal. Patricia, you cannot just tear down my fence. We went through the approval process. I have signed documents from the Architectural Review Committee." "Those approvals were issued in error," she said, her tone shifting to something more clipped and official. "Upon further review, The board determined that your fence violates HOA covenants regarding height restrictions and materials. Section 7, paragraph 12 specifically states that fences cannot exceed 6 feet in height. Yours measures 6 feet and 3 inches. I felt my jaw clench. 3 inches. You are tearing down an $8,000 fence over 3 inches. Rules are rules, Xavier. We cannot make exceptions. If we let you violate the covenants, then everyone will want to do it. The approval was a mistake that we are correcting. Then I will cut 3 inches off the top of the fence. You do not need to destroy the entire thing. The materials are also incorrect. The covenant specifies treated pine or vinyl only. Cedar is not approved. This was insane. I had submitted detailed plans showing cedar material. Someone on the Architectural Review Committee had literally signed off on it. I had emails to prove it. Patricia, I have documentation that cedar was approved. Tom Richardson signed the permit himself. Tom is no longer on the committee. His approval was not valid as he did not consult the full board. That is not my problem. You cannot retroactively invalidate a permit after the work is done and paid for. This is my property. Actually, Xavier, according to the HOA covenants you signed when you purchased your home, the association has the right to remove any non-compliant structures after proper notice has been given. What notice? I received no notice. A letter was mailed to your address 3 days ago. 3 days ago. That is not proper notice, and I never received any letter. That is also not my problem. The removal is proceeding as planned. Have a good day, Xavier. She hung up on me. I stood there in my backyard, staring at my phone in disbelief. The contractors were watching me with sympathetic expressions. So, the chainsaw guy asked. Do not touch another piece of my fence, I said. I am calling the police. I dialed 911 immediately. The dispatcher answered, and I explained the situation as calmly as I could manage. She told me she would send an officer to take a report for property destruction. While I waited, I went inside and pulled up all my documentation. The original HOA Architectural Review application, the approval letter signed by Tom Richardson, the emails discussing materials, the contractor invoices, everything. I also pulled up the HOA covenants and read through Section 7, paragraph 12. It did indeed specify a 6-foot maximum height and listed approved materials. But there was also language about Architectural Review Committee having discretionary approval for alternative materials with proper justification. A Scottsdale Police Department cruiser pulled up about 20 minutes later. The officer who got out was a young guy, maybe early 30s, with a professional demeanor. His name tag read Martinez. You called about property destruction, he asked, pulling out a notepad. I explained the entire situation while he took notes. I showed him my approval documents and the damaged fence sections. The contractors were still standing around, now sitting on the tailgate of their truck drinking water. Officer Martinez examined everything carefully. So you had approval for the fence, but the HOA is now saying that approval was invalid. Exactly. And they claim they sent me notice 3 days ago, but I never received anything. They just showed up this morning and started tearing it down. He walked over to talk to the contractors, who showed him their work order from the HOA. After about 10 minutes of discussion, he came back to me. Here is the situation, Martinez said. This is technically a civil matter between you and your HOA. The contractors have what appears to be a legitimate work order from your HOA, which according to your covenants does have authority over property modifications. However, the question of whether their approval process was followed correctly is something you will need to resolve through proper channels, possibly civil court. So they can just destroy my property and I have no recourse. I did not say that. I am going to document this as a property dispute in my report. I recommend you immediately contact the HOA in writing, send it certified mail, demanding they cease and desist. I also recommend you contact a property attorney today. If they continue destruction after receiving a cease and desist letter, that changes things. What about the damage they have already done? Document everything. Take photos, videos. Keep all receipts and communications. You will need it all if this goes to court. Officer Martinez spent another 30 minutes taking detailed photos and measurements. He gave me a case number and a copy of his report. After he left, the contractors packed up their equipment. "We're done for today anyway," the chainsaw guy said. "Got another job to get to. But we'll probably be back tomorrow unless we hear otherwise from the HOA." After they left, I spent an hour photographing the damage from every angle. The 3 destroyed fence sections represented about 30 feet of fencing, completely demolished. The cedar planks were split and unusable, the posts cut flush with the ground. It was going to cost at least $2,000 to repair, maybe more. I called my buddy Derek, who worked in real estate law. He listened to my story and then gave me the name of an attorney who specialized in HOA disputes, a woman named Sharon Chen, who had apparently made a career out of fighting abusive homeowners associations. Sharon's office was in downtown Scottsdale, and she agreed to see me that afternoon. Her office was modern and professional, with case files neatly organized on built-in shelves. Sharon herself was probably 40, sharp-eyed and direct in her manner. I laid out all my documentation on her desk and explained everything that had happened. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "This is pretty typical HOA overreach," Sharon said when I finished. "They issue an approval, then change their minds and try to retroactively invalidate it. The problem is that your covenants probably give them broad authority, but that authority is not unlimited. The key issues here are procedural due process and whether they followed their own rules. What are my options? First, we send them a cease and desist letter immediately, certified mail. We demand they stop all destruction of your fence, and we put them on notice that we are considering legal action. Second, we file for a temporary restraining order to prevent any further damage while we sort this out. Third, we prepare a lawsuit for property damage, breach of contract, and potentially bad faith. How much is this going to cost me? My retainer is $5,000. Depending on how this goes, it could be resolved quickly or it could drag out. But based on what you have shown me, you have a strong case. The approval was properly issued by someone with apparent authority. You relied on that approval in good faith and incurred substantial expense. They cannot just arbitrarily reverse that decision without proper process." I signed her retainer agreement and wrote her a check. She immediately started drafting the cease and desist letter. "I am going to have this delivered by courier today so they get it before business day ends," Sharon said. "And first thing tomorrow morning, we will file for the restraining order. Do not communicate with the HOA directly anymore. All communication goes through me now." I felt a small measure of relief having someone competent on my side. I drove home and spent the rest of the afternoon making more detailed documentation of everything. The next morning I was up early, anxious about whether the contractors would show up again. Sure enough, at 8 in the morning, I heard vehicles pulling up outside. I looked out to see not just the contractor truck, but also Patricia's white Mercedes SUV. I immediately called Sharon. "They are here again. Do not engage with them. I will be there in 20 minutes. Record everything if you can." I grabbed my phone and started recording video from my front window. Patricia got out of her Mercedes wearing one of her tennis outfits, her blonde bob perfectly styled. She was talking to the contractors, gesturing at my fence. Then she walked up to my front door and rang the bell. I kept recording but did not answer. She rang again, then knocked loudly. "Xavier, I know you are home. Your car is in the driveway. We need to discuss this situation like adults." I stayed silent, watching through the window. She rang a few more times, her expression getting increasingly irritated. Finally, she walked back to the contractors and appeared to be giving them instructions. The chainsaw guy was shaking his head, pointing to something on his phone. He appeared to be showing her something. Patricia's face turned red even from a distance. There was a heated discussion, and then Sharon's car pulled up. Sharon got out wearing a sharp business suit and carrying a briefcase. She walked directly to Patricia. "Patricia Hendricks." Sharon asked loudly enough that I could hear through the window. "Who are you?" "I am Sharon Chen, attorney for Xavier Fullerton. I delivered a cease and desist letter to your office yesterday afternoon. You were instructed to stop all destruction of my client's fence pending resolution of this dispute. I never received any letter. It was signed for by someone named Deborah at 4:15 yesterday afternoon. I have the receipt. You are now in violation of a legal order to cease and desist." "That was not a court order. It was just a letter from a lawyer. We have every right to enforce our covenants. If you instruct these contractors to do any further damage to that fence, I will immediately file for an emergency restraining order and seek damages for every dollar of destruction you cause." "Is that really the position you want to take?" Patricia's face was getting redder. "This homeowner violated our covenants. We have a duty to enforce them. Your architectural review committee approved his plans. He relied on that approval in good faith. You cannot retroactively invalidate a properly issued permit. If you believe there was an error in the approval process, you can seek remedy through proper legal channels. But you cannot unilaterally destroy his property. That is not how the law works." Several of my neighbors had come out of their houses now, watching the confrontation. The contractors were still sitting in their truck, clearly wanting no part of this. "The board has voted on this," Patricia said. "The fence comes down. Then the board is about to get sued. Let me be very clear. If one more piece of that fence is touched, I will file a lawsuit against the HOA and personally against every board member for property destruction, breach of contract, and acting beyond the scope of your authority. Arizona law allows for treble damages in cases of willful property destruction. So that $8,000 fence becomes $24,000 in damages, plus my attorney fees, which will be substantial." Patricia looked like she wanted to explode. "This is harassment. No, this is me protecting my client's legal rights. The harassment is you showing up with contractors to destroy his property without proper legal authority. We have authority under the covenants. That is for a court to decide, not you. You are not a judge. You are a homeowners association president, and you are bound by the same laws as everyone else." Sharon turned to the contractors. "Gentlemen, I strongly advise you not to do any work here today. If you damage that fence, you could be named as defendants in a lawsuit along with the HOA." The chainsaw guy nodded. "We're not doing anything, lady. This is too much drama for what we're getting paid. You all sort this out." He started his truck. Patricia practically stomped her foot. "You are under contract. Contract says we follow your instructions unless there is a legal dispute. This is clearly a legal dispute. Call us when it is sorted out." The contractors drove away. Patricia turned back to Sharon, practically vibrating with anger. "This is not over. The board will be meeting to discuss further action. You do that, and my client and I will be preparing our lawsuit. Have a good day, Miss Hendricks. Patricia stormed back to her Mercedes and peeled out of my driveway with a squeal of tires. Sharon walked to my front door and I let her in. She was smiling slightly. Well, that went about as expected. She is not going to back down easily, but we have bought some time. Let me file that restraining order application this morning. With the video you just took and her attempt to continue work after receiving the cease and desist, we have a strong case for the judge to issue an order. Thank you for getting here so fast. This is what I do. HOA presidents like Patricia have gotten used to bullying homeowners who do not know their rights. But when someone stands up to them with proper legal representation, they usually back down. She is just not there yet. Sharon left to file the court paperwork, and I finally felt like I could breathe. But I also knew this was far from over. Over the next week, things escalated in ways I never could have imagined. The restraining order hearing was scheduled for the following Monday. In the meantime, I started receiving daily violation notices from the HOA for the most ridiculous things. My grass was supposedly a quarter-inch too long. My mailbox had a small scratch that violated the appearance standards. My trash cans were visible from the street for more than 2 hours after collection day, even though I had brought them in immediately after getting home from work. Each violation came with a $50 fine. I forwarded every single one to Sharon, who added them to our growing case file. They are retaliating against you for pushing back, Sharon explained. This actually helps our case. It shows bad faith and harassment. The restraining order hearing finally arrived. Sharon and I met at the courthouse in downtown Scottsdale. Patricia showed up with her own attorney, a stern-looking man in his 60s named Richard Walsh. The judge was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s named Judge Morrison. She listened to both sides present their arguments. Sharon laid out my case with documentation showing the approved permits, the good faith reliance, and the substantial expense I had incurred. She presented the photos of the destroyed fence sections and argued that allowing further destruction would cause irreparable harm. Richard Walsh argued that the HOA had authority under the covenants to enforce compliance, and that the approval had been issued in error by someone without proper authority. He claimed the HOA had given proper notice and was simply trying to maintain community standards. Judge Morrison asked several pointed questions about the approval process and the notice requirements. She examined all the documentation carefully. "Here is my ruling," Judge Morrison finally said. "I am issuing a temporary restraining order preventing the HOA from any further destruction of the fence, pending a full hearing on the merits. However, I am also ordering the parties to engage in mediation to attempt to resolve this dispute without lengthy litigation. The mediation will be scheduled within 30 days. In the meantime, the fence stays as is, and the HOA is prohibited from taking any enforcement action related to the fence." It was not a complete victory, but it was something. Patricia looked furious as we left the courtroom. The mediation was scheduled for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, I started talking to my neighbors more. I learned that I was not the only person who had issues with Patricia and the HOA board. Several people shared stories of similar harassment and questionable fines. My neighbor directly to the right, a guy named Marcus, told me he had been fined $2,000 over the past year for violations he swore were made up. My neighbor on the left, an older woman named Helen, said she had received a violation notice because her rose bushes were allegedly not an approved variety, even though they had been there when she bought the house 5 years ago. "Patricia has gotten completely out of control," Helen said. "But everyone is too afraid to speak up because they do not want to be targeted like you are being targeted. An idea started forming in my mind. What if this was not just about my fence? What if Patricia and the board were abusing their authority in ways that affected the entire community? I started doing research. Arizona law required HOAs to maintain detailed financial records and make them available to homeowners upon request. I submitted a formal written request to inspect the HOA financial records for the past 3 years. The HOA had 15 days to respond. On day 14, I received a letter from Richard Wall stating that the records were being compiled and would be available for inspection at the HOA office on a specific date and time 2 weeks away. When I showed up at the appointed time, Patricia was waiting with a massive stack of disorganized papers and receipts. It was clearly an attempt to overwhelm me with data rather than provide organized records. "Here are the records you requested," Patricia said with false sweetness. "You have 2 hours to review them here. You cannot remove anything or make copies. Arizona law says I am entitled to copies at reasonable cost, 50 cents per page. There had to be thousands of pages here, but I came prepared. I had brought my laptop with a scanning attachment on my phone. I spent the entire 2 hours scanning documents as fast as I could, prioritizing anything that looked like financial statements, invoices, or board meeting minutes. What I found was disturbing. The HOA had been paying Patricia's company for management consulting to the tune of $30,000 per year, even though she was supposedly a volunteer president. There were numerous payments to vendors that seemed excessive, including the contractor who had been hired to destroy my fence. That same contractor had been paid over $100,000 in the past year for various maintenance work around the community, which seemed astronomically high for a neighborhood of only 85 homes. There were also several payments to Richard Walsh for legal fees, which was not unusual, but the amount seemed excessive, nearly $50,000 in the past year alone. What was this HOA doing that required that much legal work? I shared everything I found with Sharon. She brought in a forensic accountant who reviewed the documents I had scanned. His preliminary report was damning. There appeared to be a pattern of self-dealing and possible embezzlement. Patricia was essentially paying herself and her allies with HOA funds while using the authority of the board to harass homeowners into compliance. "This is bigger than your fence," Sharon said. "This could be criminal fraud, but we need more evidence before we make any accusations." The mediation day arrived. It was held in a conference room at a neutral location with a professional mediator. Patricia showed up with Richard Walsh and 2 other board members, a woman named Susan and a man named Gary. Both looked uncomfortable to be there. The mediator tried to find common ground, but Patricia was completely inflexible. She insisted the fence had to come down completely and be rebuilt to exact specifications at my expense. "What if we compromise on the height issue?" the mediator suggested. "Mr. Fullerton has offered to cut 3 inches off the top of the fence to bring it into compliance." "The material is still wrong," Patricia insisted. "The cedar is actually higher quality than the specified pine or vinyl," Sharon pointed out. "It is more expensive and more durable." "How does that harm the community?" "It violates the covenants. We cannot allow violations." Sharon pulled out a folder. "Speaking of violations, I have photographic evidence of at least 12 other homes in Meadowbrook Springs that have similar covenant violations that the HOA has never enforced. Different mailbox styles, wrong paint colors, landscaping that exceeds height limits. Yet Mr. Fullerton is being targeted for a 3-inch height difference that was approved by your own committee. Those situations are different." "How are they different?" Patricia did not have a good answer. Richard Walsh jumped in. "We are prepared to offer a settlement. Mr. Fullerton can keep the fence if he pays a special assessment to the HOA for the administrative costs of dealing with this matter. $5,000. I almost laughed. "You want me to pay you $5,000 because you tried to tear down my fence? It is a compromise." "No, it is extortion. I was approved to build the fence. I built it according to the approved plans. You changed your mind and destroyed 3 sections of it. You owe me for the repairs, not the other way around." The mediation went nowhere. After 4 hours, the mediator gave up. "I am going to report to the court that mediation was unsuccessful. This will proceed to full litigation." As we were leaving, I noticed Gary, one of the board members, lingering behind. He caught up with me in the parking lot. "Mr. Fullerton, can I speak with you privately?" he asked nervously, glancing around as if worried Patricia might see him. "Sure." We walked to a quiet corner of the parking lot. Gary was probably 60, retired, with the kind of tired expression of someone carrying a burden. "Look, I want you to know that not everyone on the board agrees with what Patricia is doing. Susan and I voted against tearing down your fence. But Patricia has a majority, and she railroads everything through. The other 2 board members basically do whatever she says. Why do not you speak up? Because she will make my life hell, just like she is doing to you. But there is something you should know. The contractor she hired to tear down your fence is her cousin. His company gets all the HOA contracts, and those management consulting fees she is collecting. The board never actually voted to approve those. She just started paying herself and told us it was approved by the previous board, but I checked the old meeting minutes. There is no record of it. This was huge. Would you be willing to testify to that?" Gary looked scared. "I do not know, I mean maybe, but Patricia will kick me off the board." "She cannot just kick you off. You were elected by the homeowners. She will find a way, she always does." "Gary, if what you are saying is true, Patricia is committing fraud. She is stealing money from the HOA, which means from every homeowner in this community. This is not about my fence anymore. This is about holding her accountable." Gary thought for a long moment. "Let me talk to Susan. If she is willing to back me up, then maybe we can do something, but we need protection." I gave him Sharon's business card. "Call her, she can help." Over the next few days, both Gary and Susan reached out to Sharon. They were willing to testify about Patricia's misconduct, but they wanted to do it the right way. Sharon advised them to call for a special meeting of the board to address the financial irregularities. According to the HOA bylaws, any 3 board members could call a special meeting. Gary, Susan, and one other reasonable board member named Robert called for a meeting to review the HOA finances and discuss the president's conduct. Patricia tried to block it, but the bylaws were clear. The meeting had to happen. Sharon advised me to attend as a homeowner. The bylaws allowed any homeowner to attend board meetings and speak during the public comment period. The meeting was held in the community clubhouse on a Thursday evening. I showed up to find the room packed with homeowners. Word had spread about the conflict, and people were curious. Patricia sat at the head table with the other board members, looking like she wanted to be anywhere else. Gary called the meeting to order. "We are here tonight to address concerns about HOA financial management and potential misconduct by the board president." Patricia immediately tried to shut it down. "This is inappropriate. These accusations are baseless, and I will not sit here and be slandered." "You do not have the authority to end this meeting," Susan said firmly. "We called it properly under the bylaws, and we are going to have this discussion." Gary presented evidence of the payments to Patricia's company without proper board approval. He showed invoices from Patricia's cousin's contracting company that seemed inflated. He raised questions about the legal fees being paid to Richard Walsh. Patricia's face was getting redder and redder. This is a witch hunt. I have done nothing but serve this community faithfully. Then explain the payments, Gary said. Show us where the board approved paying your company $30,000 a year. It was approved by the previous board. I have reviewed every meeting minute from the past 5 years. There is no such approval. Homeowners in the audience started murmuring. People were pulling out their phones, taking notes, recording. Patricia stood up. I will not be treated like a criminal in front of this community. This meeting is adjourned. She tried to walk out. Sit down, Susan said loudly. We are not finished. You cannot tell me what to do. I am a board member, same as you. And right now, I am making a motion to suspend you from your duties as president pending an independent audit of the HOA finances. Seconded, Gary said immediately. Patricia looked shocked. You cannot do that. Actually, we can, Robert, the third board member who had called the meeting, spoke up. Under the bylaws, the board can suspend an officer for cause by a majority vote, and potential embezzlement is definitely cause. This is absurd. I want a vote of the full board. Fine. All in favor of suspending Patricia Hendricks as president pending an independent audit. Gary, Susan, and Robert raised their hands. The other 2 board members who had been Patricia's allies looked uncertain. Finally, they both raised their hands as well. Motion passes unanimously, Gary said. You are suspended effective immediately. Patricia, please surrender any HOA property including keys, files, and checkbooks. Patricia absolutely lost it. She started screaming about lawsuits and conspiracies, about ungrateful homeowners and legal action. Richard Walsh, who had been sitting in the back, tried to calm her down, but she shoved him away. You are all going to regret this, Patricia shouted. I will sue every single one of you. She stormed out of the clubhouse, slamming the door so hard the wall shook. The room erupted in shocked conversation. Gary gavelled for order. We will be hiring an independent forensic accountant to conduct a full audit of the HOA finances, Gary announced. Once we have that report, we will determine what further action needs to be taken. In the meantime, I will serve as acting president. During the public comment period, I stood up and gave a brief summary of what had happened with my fence, tying it into the broader pattern of abuse by Patricia. Several other homeowners stood up and shared their own stories of harassment and questionable fines. By the end of the meeting, there was a clear consensus that Patricia had been abusing her authority for years, and people were relieved that something was finally being done about it. Over the next 2 weeks, the independent audit was conducted. The forensic accountant, a thorough professional named David Kramer, went through every financial record with a fine-tooth comb. His report was devastating. Patricia had embezzled approximately $85,000 from the HOA over 3 years through fake invoicing, unauthorized payments to her own company, and kickbacks from her cousin's contracting company. Her cousin had been overcharging for work and splitting the excess with Patricia. The board met in executive session to review the report. Based on David's findings, Gary called the police. 2 detectives from the Scottsdale Police Department White-Collar Crimes Division showed up at Patricia's house on a Tuesday morning. I heard about it from Helen, who lived down the street from Patricia. They were there for hours, Helen told me excitedly. They carried out boxes of documents and her computer. She looked absolutely furious when they led her out in handcuffs. Patricia was arrested and charged with embezzlement, fraud, and theft. Her cousin was also arrested for his role in the scheme. The local news picked up the story, and suddenly Meadowbrook Springs HOA was in headlines. Sharon reached out to the new board leadership and negotiated a settlement for me. The HOA agreed to pay for the complete repair of my fence, plus an additional $5,000 for my trouble and legal fees. They also formally apologized and expunged all the retaliatory violations from my record. The 3 destroyed sections of fence were professionally repaired within 2 weeks. The HOA even paid for an upgrade to my gate hardware as a goodwill gesture. As for Patricia, her legal troubles were just beginning. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office was prosecuting her case aggressively. Richard Walsh, the attorney, was also under investigation for his role, though it seemed he might have been duped by Patricia rather than being an active participant in the fraud. I attended Patricia's preliminary hearing a few months later. She looked diminished somehow, wearing a plain gray suit instead of her usual tennis outfits, her hair not quite as perfectly styled. She pleaded not guilty, and her attorney argued that there had been a misunderstanding about the HOA's financial management. The prosecution presented the forensic audit and testimony from David Kramer. It was damning. The evidence showed a clear pattern of intentional fraud over multiple years. The case eventually went to trial 8 months after Patricia's arrest. I was called as a witness to testify about the fence incident and how it had led to the investigation. Sharon came with me for support. The courtroom was intimidating, but the prosecutor, a sharp woman named Alicia Sanchez, prepared me well. I told my story simply and honestly about how Patricia had ordered my fence destroyed and how that had revealed the larger pattern of abuse. Other homeowners testified about Patricia's harassment and retaliation. The forensic accountant walked the jury through the financial evidence. Patricia's cousin testified that he had given Patricia kickbacks in exchange for the HOA contracts, providing detailed records of cash payments. Patricia's attorney tried to argue that she had simply made mistakes in bookkeeping, that there was no criminal intent, but the evidence was overwhelming. After 3 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Patricia showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but I saw her hands shaking. At sentencing 2 months later, the judge was harsh. She talked about the betrayal of trust, about how Patricia had taken advantage of her position to steal from her neighbors and community. Patricia was sentenced to 5 years in state prison and ordered to pay full restitution of $85,000 plus interest. Her cousin received 3 years and was also ordered to pay restitution. The whole ordeal had taken over a year from start to finish, but justice had been served. As for Meadowbrook Springs, the community underwent significant changes. Gary served as president for a year before declining to run again. A new board was elected with a much more collaborative and transparent approach. They implemented new financial controls, required 2 signatures on all checks, and established quarterly financial reviews by an outside accountant. The HOA also revised its covenant enforcement procedures to require proper notice, an opportunity for homeowners to respond before fines were issued, and a fair appeals process. No more arbitrary decisions or targeting of specific homeowners. My fence stood proudly, all sections intact, a symbol of standing up to abuse of authority. Neighbors would sometimes walk by and comment on it, knowing the story behind it. I became friendly with several neighbors throughout the process, including Marcus and Helen. We formed a sort of unofficial neighborhood watch, not for crime, but to keep the HOA board accountable and make sure nobody ever abused their authority like Patricia had again. Sharon sent me a final invoice about 18 months after everything started. The HOA had paid most of my legal fees as part of the settlement, but I still owed her a small balance. I wrote the check happily, knowing she had been worth every penny. I never saw Patricia again after the sentencing. I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that her husband divorced her and moved out of state. Her house went into foreclosure when she could not make the mortgage payments from prison. Someone bought it as an investment property and rented it out. The whole experience taught me valuable lessons about knowing your rights, standing up to bullies, and the importance of community. HOAs can serve valuable purposes in maintaining property values and managing common areas, but they need oversight and accountability like any other organization with authority. On a sunny Saturday morning about 2 years after the whole mess started, I was in my backyard grilling burgers when I heard a knock on my fence gate. It was Marcus with his wife and kids. "Hey, Xavier, we are having a neighborhood potluck later. You should come by. Gary is bringing his famous ribs. Helen is making her potato salad." "I will be there," I said. "What can I bring? Just yourself. Oh, and maybe some of those burgers. They smell amazing." As they walked away, I looked at my fence standing tall and solid, exactly 6 feet and 3 inches high, made of beautiful cedar that had aged to a perfect silvery gray. Every time I looked at it, I remembered what it represented. It was not just a fence. It was proof that ordinary people can stand up to petty tyrants and win. It was evidence that communities are stronger when people look out for each other, instead of letting bullies divide them. And it was a reminder that sometimes the smallest things, like 3 inches of fence height, can reveal much bigger problems lurking beneath the surface. The civil lawsuit against Patricia and her cousin to recover the HOA's losses was still ongoing, but that was in the hands of a collections attorney. The homeowners association had recovered most of the stolen money through insurance and the criminal restitution order, so the immediate financial crisis had been resolved. Life in Meadowbrook Springs was peaceful now. The new board focused on actual community improvement rather than harassment. They organized neighborhood events, maintained the common areas properly, and treated homeowners with respect. I thought about how differently things could have gone. If I had not documented everything, if I had not hired Sharon, if I had just given in and torn down my fence, Patricia would likely still be running the HOA like her personal fiefdom. She would still be stealing from the community and making everyone miserable. Sometimes I wondered if she ever reflected on how a fence led to her downfall. How her vendetta against one homeowner revealed years of fraud and landed her in prison. There was probably a lesson there about how criminals often get caught not through grand investigations, but through their own arrogance and overreach. The repair bill I had sent to the HOA, initially rejected with scorn by Patricia, had ultimately been paid in full along with substantial additional compensation. That repair bill had been the first domino in a chain that toppled Patricia's entire corrupt operation. As I finished grilling my burgers and packed them up to take to the neighborhood potluck, I felt grateful for how everything had turned out. Yes, it had been stressful and expensive and time-consuming. Yes, there had been moments when I wondered if it was worth fighting over a fence. But in the end, it had been about so much more than a fence. It had been about justice, accountability, and community, and those things were always worth fighting for. The potluck was held in the community park, a nice green space with playground equipment and picnic tables. About 40 neighbors showed up, and the atmosphere was relaxed and friendly in a way that would have been impossible 2 years ago when everyone was afraid of being targeted by Patricia for some imagined violation. Kids ran around playing while adults chatted and ate. Gary gave a brief speech thanking everyone for supporting the reforms and looking forward to continued positive changes. Someone made a joke about how Patricia was probably eating very different food these days, which got some uncomfortable laughs. Helen caught my eye and raised her glass of lemonade in a toast. I raised mine back. We understood each other. We had both stood up when it mattered. As the sun set over Scottsdale, casting orange and pink across the desert sky, I felt contentment. My fence was intact. My community was healing. Justice had been served. And I had learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to be bullied, even when it would be easier to just give in. The story of my fence became something of a legend in Meadowbrook Springs. New residents would hear about it and ask questions. It served as a reminder and a warning about what could happen when HOA board members forgot they were serving their community, not ruling over it. I kept in touch with Sharon, who moved on to help other homeowners facing HOA abuse. She told me my case had become one of her favorites to reference when explaining to clients why documentation and proper legal representation mattered. The contractors who had been hired to destroy my fence reached out months later to apologize. The chainsaw operator, whose name I learned was Jimmy, said he felt terrible about the whole thing and wished he had refused the job from the start. I did not hold it against him. He had just been trying to make a living and got caught in the middle of someone else's corruption. Richard Walsh, Patricia's attorney, ended up with a reprimand from the state bar but avoided criminal charges. The investigation determined he had been negligent in not questioning Patricia's authority and financial arrangements more closely, but there was no evidence he knew about the embezzlement. He retired from practicing law shortly after. As for the other 2 board members who had been Patricia's allies, they resigned in shame once the extent of her crimes became clear. They claimed they had not known what she was doing, and there was no evidence to contradict that. They were just weak people who had gone along with a bully. The HOA used the insurance payout and recovered funds to make improvements around the community that had been neglected during Patricia's reign. Potholes were fixed, landscaping was updated, the pool was resurfaced. It was amazing how much good could be done when money was used for its intended purpose instead of being stolen. I occasionally thought about Patricia in prison, wondered what she thought about, whether she felt any remorse. Probably not. People like that rarely do. They always find a way to see themselves as the victim, to justify their actions. But that was not my problem anymore. My life had returned to normal, or rather, to a better normal than before. I had real friendships with neighbors now instead of just polite waves. I had learned to stand up for myself in ways I had not before. I had discovered that the legal system, while imperfect and slow, could work when you had good representation and clear evidence. The fence stood as my monument to all of that. Not a monument to ego or defiance, but to the principle that sometimes you have to fight for what is right even when it is hard, even when it is expensive, even when it would be easier to just accept injustice. Every time I walked into my backyard and saw that fence, solid and well built and exactly the way I wanted it, I smiled. It was my fence on my property, built according to properly approved plans, and nobody could take that away from me. The 3 sections that had been destroyed and repaired were actually slightly better than the originals. The replacement contractor had been extremely careful to match everything perfectly, and the craftsmanship was excellent. You could not even tell which sections were repairs unless you looked very closely at the weathering pattern of the wood. As months turned into years, the story of the fence became part of who I was in the community. Xavier's the guy who took down the corrupt HOA president, people would say when introducing me to new neighbors. It was a strange legacy, but I was proud of it. I made it a point to attend HOA board meetings regularly, not to cause trouble but to stay informed and involved. My presence, and that of other engaged homeowners, kept the board honest and reminded them they were accountable to the community. The lawsuit that Patricia had threatened against everyone never materialized, of course. That had been an empty threat from someone used to bullying others into submission. From prison, she had no power, no authority, no ability to intimidate anyone. I did receive one letter from her, about a year into her sentence. It came forwarded through the HOA's attorney. In it, she did not apologize but instead blamed everyone else for her situation. Me for causing trouble over a stupid fence, Gary and Susan for betraying her, the forensic accountant for being too thorough, the prosecutor for being too aggressive, the jury for not understanding the pressures she was under. I read it once and then threw it away. There was nothing to be gained from engaging with that kind of delusion. Life went on. I dated someone for a while, a nice woman I met through friends. It did not work out long term, but we parted on good terms. I got a promotion at work. I adopted a dog, a rescue mutt who loved lounging in the backyard by the fence. The fence aged gracefully, the cedar weathering to a beautiful silver gray that actually looked better than when it was new. I treated it annually with a wood preservative to maintain its integrity. It would probably last 40 years or more with proper care. Sometimes I stood by my back window in the evening, watching the sunset, the dog at my feet, and thought about how differently my life could have gone if I had made different choices during that crisis. If I had just accepted Patricia's authority and torn down the fence, if I had not fought back, I would have lost $8,000. I would still be living under a corrupt, abusive HOA board. Patricia would still be stealing from the community. Other homeowners would still be harassed and intimidated. One person's decision to stand up had changed everything. That was the real lesson of the fence. Not that you should fight every battle or turn every disagreement into a war, but that some battles are worth fighting, and you do not always know at the beginning how important they will turn out to be. My fence was just a fence, until it became a symbol, until it exposed corruption, until it changed a community. I wondered sometimes if there were other HOAs out there like ours had been, with presidents like Patricia abusing their authority and stealing from their neighbors. Probably many. But maybe, somewhere, another homeowner would hear my story and be inspired to stand up, to document everything, to hire a lawyer, to refuse to be bullied. That was a legacy I could be proud of. As I finished writing my account of everything that had happened, something I had been working on for weeks, I felt a sense of closure. The whole ordeal had taken nearly 2 years from start to finish, but it was truly over now. Patricia was in prison, the community was healed, my fence was intact. I saved the document and backed it up to the cloud. Maybe someday someone would want to read the full story, learn from it, understand how ordinary people can fight back against petty tyrants and win. My phone buzzed with a text from Marcus inviting me to watch the football game at his house. I texted back that I would be there, then looked out at my fence one more time. In the fading light, it stood strong and solid, exactly where it belonged. And that was really the end of it. The fence that started everything, standing tall in my backyard, a reminder that justice is possible when you refuse to give up.